Welcome, everybody. Glad to see you all here and really glad to get to share my excitement about soil health. You'll probably be able to tell I'm pretty excited about soil health. It's something that has really driven me for a number of years now. And it is something that can really connect to all of your lives, all of your work. I think my computer kind of quit just as Chris was saying that some of you said you live and breathe it and others do not have background. And so I will try to give you, a good broad overview. And for some of you, it'll be a little too much. And for some of you, it'll be stuff you've heard before. And I just want to acknowledge ahead of time that I will try to give each of you something that you can take out of this that's really exciting. So I'm putting this here, the path to stronger agriculture is under our feet. I really think the soil as a foundation is a great way to look at all this. You all are in the business of protecting land. And one of the ways to think of protecting land is we're not just protecting the land itself, we're protecting its ability to be high functioning, its ability to be resilient, to continue to feed us, to be regenerative systems that build our social, environmental, and economic viability for many generations to come. And the soil is at the foundation of that land. Let's see here. I know that a number of you said that most of your land is in beef grazing. So one of the things I'm going to do as I talk about the basics, the practices, the benefits, the barriers of soil health, I'm going to address them from both the crop angle and from the pasture angle. So I'll address some of both. There are some of you that may want a whole lot more in-depth information. And I just want to say right now, there's so much out there. I used to teach a whole semester 4-credit class on sustainable soil management, and there was still more there to learn. And there are folks who have been working in this space for many decades, and we always learn more. So one of the exciting things about soil health is, it's engaging and exciting information. And I think all of us have something to learn from each other. So one of the things I'd love to do in discussion is to have you all share your experiences so that the others in the room can learn from you and can ask you questions, because I think you all in the Southeast will have some similar experiences and can share with each other, build a network with each other on how to get producers, landowners connected to the right resources. Couple of objectives for today. I would love to achieve the following. If all of you can, by the end of this session, become comfortable talking about why soil health matters and what some of those benefits are, to a landowner, to anybody you're talking with, to stakeholders in your community. Why is it that soil health matters so much? What is it that drives soil function at the core? What is soil health? If you can define it to somebody in a way that makes sense, that would be fantastic. And then to be able to get a little bit into how soil health relates to regenerative agriculture and climate resiliency. That's an important component. We're trying to build up that regenerative aspect of our agriculture to actually improve things rather than just sustain them. We're looking to improve things. Soil health management systems, I'd love for you all to come out of this having a basic understanding of what the core soil health management systems principles are that apply nationally, and a couple of ways that those apply locally to you and the systems that you work in. And then we'll discuss some of the barriers to adoption. I think a number of you are probably familiar with some of them. And so we will discuss those, and hopefully all of you will come away with a few interesting new aspects of that, both out of my session and I think really relevantly out of Michelle's session later today when she and her team talk about the economics of soil health and what we have discovered about that. I think there's just so much hope and so many exciting things that can be gained from that for helping folks adopt. So I'm going to go through this in 3 parts. The first part will be an introduction to the basics and benefits of soil health. So what is it we're talking about? What is soil health? What are those basics? And then we'll talk a bit about practices and pulling those systems, those practices together into soil health management systems that address all the principles. And then we'll talk about the barriers. So I don't know whether this part is showing for you all. There we go. Okay, so introduction. Sorry, having trouble with our screens here. So first off, I'd like to say, just stepping back out, setting the stage, we have some pretty dire things going on this planet right now, right? I mean, we've got a changing climate, things are getting hotter, things are getting wetter, the population is growing. Food security, we're generally in pretty good shape in this country, although we really saw the impact of the way that our systems are set up right now when the pandemic hit. Farm economy, water quality and quantity still remain big issues, even though we've been working on them for decades, and they very much tie together with climate, and soil health is at the core of solving those. Air quality, human health issues, consumer demands, the loss of agricultural soils, right? All of these are issues that we're grappling with across the globe, really, and certainly in this nation. And when it comes to climate, while there may be disagreement about exactly how much the climate is changing and exactly where we're headed by when, there is not doubt about whether the climate is changing and that where we're headed is going to be really difficult for us as humans. Now, I want to acknowledge here, the ecosystem of the planet has gone through a lot of changes, and so the planet will be fine. There'll be different organisms, but really what we're talking about when we're talking about building climate resilience, for us as a human species, for us to be able to subsist on this planet, we're going to have to get that under control. That's pretty dire. Then we start talking about the challenges for our producers. So really kind of zooming in on agriculture, what are our producers tackling right now? They're experiencing hurricanes, droughts, floods, heat extremes, seedlings not even being able to make it to a full crop because it gets too hot or because they get frozen because there are so many shifts, right? And that combined with water quantity issues, the reliability of access to water, pest and disease issues that are shifting as the climate changes, risks, prices, inputs, markets, loss of land, land access tends to be a big issue for especially our beginning farmers, and consumer needs. So, we could throw our hands up in the air and say, okay, this is just way too difficult to tackle. I'm just not even going to bother. I'm going to hide under my blanket and just go home, right? But no, we're not going to do that. What I'm here to say is actually, soil health is one big solution. Not the only solution, but it's a huge solution in the toolbox. For all of those of you who have the amazing job of conserving our nation's land, one additional thing you can add is to allow for that land to be high functioning, to build up that resilience, and to really start to address all of these issues that we just talked about. Every single one of them is connected in one way or other to that foundation, healthy soils. And what you're seeing here, these pictures, these are a whole bunch of side-by-sides of healthy versus not healthy soils. And we'll get into what it is that we're seeing here throughout this talk, but just, look at these two side by side, right? We've got very degraded soil next to nice brown, crumbly, you might call it a, brownie kind of soil, nice crumbly soils here, very cloddy right there. And you see the color differences, you see differences in crusting, you see this pasture looking beautiful and green and like it's lush, and this one really not. All of those differences are management differences that are related to how management impacts the functioning of those soils. And what we're here to talk about today is how it is that our management can so much impact soils that we drive all these functions that help us resolve, or at least start to resolve, some of all of those issues that we just talked about. So if we are bold in our thinking, here's Hugh Hammond Bennett back in 1943, bold in our thinking, courageous in accepting new ideas, and willing to work with instead of against our land, we shall find in conservation farming an avenue to the greatest food production the world has ever known. That's pretty visionary, right? This was back in 1943. The climate challenge was not recognized yet. We didn't have as much degradation of our soils yet, but actually there was a lot of degradation going on at the time. We've fixed some of it. We've continued on some of it. Our agriculture has gotten bigger. We've taken out a lot of fence rows, but what he said back then still applies today. And I think a really key piece to this message is that we as human beings have to change our thinking. Before I joined AFT, I was with the Soil Health Division at NRCS, built up that division, brought soil health up through the agency, to really push on that. But really, Hugh Hammond Bennett was talking about this back then. And the thing that we're still grappling with today that he was already seeing back then is it's about a paradigm shift, right? When you talk to a producer and they tell you, I'm going to do it the way my dad did it. I'm going to do it the way my grandpa did it. It's working. If it ain't fixed, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? There's a lot of that out there. And one of the ways that we get to changing things with our agricultural communities is by creating paradigm shifts. And that's really what Hugh was talking about here, is we have to be bold. We have to be courageous, right? We're all human beings. We all want to be accepted, but if we can get excited about new opportunities together, think outside the box and be willing to work with instead of against our land, right? Really recognizing it as an ecosystem and recognizing the way that these ecosystems work, we can do something about it. There's exciting opportunity, and I think that we can continue to produce food and produce more food in the long run by applying the soil health management systems principles. So when it comes to soils, what is it that we're looking for our soils to provide us, right? We want them to produce food, fiber, feed, biofuels, medicines. There's a lot of stuff that comes from our soils. I used to teach kids in school, worked with teachers for a while, and one of the fun exercises that you might want to pick up for something, one of the fun exercises we did was say, name one thing that you think has nothing to do with soil, and we will figure out a way to connect it. And we were slightly challenged by some, but we always came up with a way to connect anything that they come up with to soils, because the functions are broad. So producing all of those things that we need for being able to live, or those things that lead up to being able to produce those things, capturing, filtering, and storing water, right? It rains. What happens when that raindrop hits the soil surface? There's a big difference between whether that raindrop goes into the soil and is there to allow the next crop to grow, or whether that raindrop runs off, taking with it sediments, nutrients, etc. Cycling and recycling nutrients. This is a big thing. A lot of farmers are very familiar with taking a soil test, having that soil test tell them, okay, you've got enough phosphorus, or you need to apply phosphorus. But what not every farmer realizes is that actually our soils cycle nutrients. And if we feed our soils well, a lot of those nutrients will be cycled and provided to the crop. And really what we need to do is, in some way or other, bring enough nutrients in so that we have enough for that crop that comes back off. And we can really further those cycles. Resilience to drought, flood, and temperature extremes. Imagine a 2-inch rainfall on a large watershed scale. If the soils are able to infiltrate all of that rain, we will not have the flood at the end of that watershed where all that water comes out. But if that 2-inch rainstorm is too much for those soils, because those soils are degraded and can't take all that in, well, now we've got a flood, right? So that's what we're talking about there, that resilience, right? If we can't make it rain, but if that rain goes in, instead of running off, we're better off while it's raining. If that rain goes in and is stored, then we have that to help us get through that drought better. Temperature extremes, protecting plants from pathogens and stress. The biodiversity really helps with that. Detoxifying pollutants, storing carbon, and moderating the release of gases. So when we talk about climate, we really want to draw down carbon. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We really want to minimize how much those greenhouse gases go back up in the atmosphere, and soils can help do that when we manage them appropriately. Resisting erosive forces, habitat for biodiversity, right? These are all things that we're looking for our soils to do. They're all things that keep us alive. So soils, what are they? I'm gonna just take 30 seconds for those of you who don't have a soils background. Soils, I like to look at soils as an interface and a foundation, right? We've been talking about how soils are connected to everything. Soils have gaseous exchange and energy exchange with the air. There's soil water exchange and evaporation between soil and water in the atmosphere. Soil and mineral exchange, soil formation, leaching, and interactions with life, right? All of our underground life that we'll talk about a bit more is in the soil. So soil is kind of a foundation and an interface, and is at the center of all of these interactions that are happening. And what is that soil? When you pick up a handful of soil, this is a very generic diagram. These percentages are not always the same, but approximately when you pick up a handful of soil, about half of that soil is going to be mineral matter. So that means clay, sand, silt particles. And of that, so about half of it, and then there's about 5% organic matter. Again, very changeable, right? Depending on where you are in the country. In the Southeast, you're much more likely to have much lower organic matter. If you're in a very sandy soil, it's much more likely to be much lower, right? So you want higher soil organic matter. What you can achieve depends on where you are and your management, but that organic matter is really key for soil function, and it could be anywhere from, you know, less than 1% all the way up to 10%, depending on that soil type, depending on management. Now, the really interesting part of soil is really the empty space. If you look at soil, right, it's crumbly. If you think of a brownie with all of its pores and sort of the dark, crumbly pieces, right? That's probably a good analogy that everybody can relate to. Those pores, that empty space in soil, is filled with air, with water, and with microorganisms, biota. Those biota are generally the smallest fraction of the volume and generally the biggest driver of function. They do most of the nutrient cycling. They do most of the pest suppression. They sequester organic matter. They release organic matter. They help feed our plants. They help protect them from harm. Some of them are pests, right? There's a huge, interesting population of organisms in there, and they drive soil function. So what is soil health then? Soil health has been defined by NRCS. A lot of other organizations have picked up that definition. And I'm just going to say, you know, there are still some researchers who say, don't call it health. It's not an organism, right? Soil is not an organism, but it's an ecosystem, and it has a lot of life in it. And all of us can relate to the idea of health because we can relate to our own health. And so translating that to soils, the term soil health has caught on a lot more than the term soil quality that was used before that. I think because farmers can relate, farmers can think about the life in the soil and how much that drives function. So the definition of soil health, the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, right? That's key. Continuous. We want that capacity to continue to be there, right? We want that soil to have the ability to function in all those different ways we just talked about and more. It's a vital living ecosystem. It is an ecosystem that supports all of life on Earth. So sometimes I like to shorten it just to say it's the continued capacity of the soil to function, right? It is about soil function. It is about the soil doing all those things that we need it to do. A way to visualize soils that I find often helps for folks that haven't really thought about soil much is this idea that an aggregate is like a house. You know, you kind of think of our soil beneath our feet as a megacity. And when I'm talking about megacity, I'm not kidding you. Take a handful of soil, there are more organisms in that handful of soil than there are people on Earth. More than there are people on Earth, right? Billions and billions of organisms just in a handful. How many does that mean for an acre, for all of our agricultural land, right? And those organisms are driving function. The interesting stuff, like we just talked about, is happening in all those empty spaces. And if you destroy those empty spaces, if you keep them from being interconnected, if you take out the large pores, that's the first thing that happens when soils get compacted. You take out those large pores, water will no longer flow through them as easily. You get puddling, you get ponding, you get runoff, you don't get that infiltration. Your soils are no longer as drought resilient. We really need those large pores. We really need those intermediate pores. That's where a lot of the organisms live. That's where water is stored so that it's available during a drought. The small pores, more water storage, right? We need the large pores to make sure that air comes back into the soil after that rainstorm, so that everything down there, all those organisms, all those plant roots can breathe easily. So this I've often compared to a house because then there's another analogy. We're going to talk a bit about the soil health management principles, and one of them is to minimize disturbance, biological, chemical, and physical disturbance. The analogy here is if you have an earthquake, you no longer have those rooms and those hallways in that house. That house is no longer useful for those same purposes. Similarly for soils, if you till a lot, if you overgraze, if you traffic a soil when it is wet, if you overgraze, especially while it's wet, all of that is a physical disturbance to the soil that will take away those large pores, and that will make that soil much less functional. So key to keep that house in place, right? We are needing to take care of billions and billions of organisms down there. Let's do it right. Who are those organisms, right? This soil food web graphic displays some of them. And I'm not going to go through all of the organisms. There's an amazing diversity of life beneath the soil and subsisting on all of that life that's beneath the soil. It is an incredible food web. What I want to point to here is what drives it all, right? Solar energy is what drives all life on Earth, and it does that initially through that energy being used in photosynthesis, and those plants growing the above ground biomass, growing the roots, and then those roots giving off all sorts of yummy, delicious, various different compounds to all that life beneath the surface. So that is how all that life subsists. Now we can till in some compost, right? We can put some compost on the surface. We can add organic matter that originally was formed through photosynthesis. We can add it in different ways, but the most common way, the way that nature does it, right, is growing lots of different kinds of plants across the entire surface. So some great soil health experts who have been out there talking about soil health and how to make it all work have talked a lot about how if there's one thing to remember, keep the soil covered with living plants year round. That really drives everything else, right? If we can get plants growing everywhere, ideally diverse plants growing everywhere, feeding our animals that are our livestock, feeding all of those microorganisms, that's really going to drive a lot of our soil health principles that we'll get into. So that's a key. We want to bring more carbon in through photosynthesis. That means we've got to grow plants all the time. What does that do? Well, those roots, the fungi that live on those roots, all that stuff that comes out of the roots, they glue together aggregates. And we then get what I was just talking about, right? When it rains, we get infiltration because it goes in between the aggregates through those large pores instead of all these aggregates falling apart because they're not stable and getting a lot of runoff, getting flooding, not recharging the soil water, right? And that's key in order to drive the function of those production systems. A farmer who has soils that really are doing this is going to make it through a drought better than a farmer who does not. We can think about this a different way in terms of resilience and resistance. If a soil has a certain capacity to function at 100%, and there's a disturbance event, whether that's a hurricane, whether that's overgrazing, whether that's a tillage event, a soil with high resistance will maintain its function through that disturbance event. A soil with low resistance but high resilience will lose its function, but then it will be able to be built back up, right? We can regenerate soils, build them back up, especially when they've got high resilience. When we have a soil with low resistance and low resilience, it will respond to that disturbance event. It'll have a decrease in function and it'll be really hard to build it back up. I would argue that soil health practices in most cases can help us do this, can help us regenerate those soils. But there are certainly some soils, especially fragile soils in the Southwest, that decades ago there was a disturbance event and it has been really difficult to bring it back. So that exists, but arguably in the Southeast, there's plenty of rainfall, there's plenty of sunshine, there's growing season basically all the way around the year. And so we have a lot of opportunities in the Southeast to really maximize how much we're growing plants and how much we're building that resistance and resilience of soils and regenerating the function that has been degraded throughout a lot of the country. So how do you tell, right? When you're walking across some land with a landowner, what might be some signs that you can either see or stories they might tell you that might have you think, there might be some degradation going on here. We're not seeing that these soils are functioning fully. So characteristics. Certainly if you see gullies like this, if you're walking across a pasture and sticking the shovel in the ground and the soil cracks apart in perfect angular blocks like this and is really hard, if you have crusting and splitting and cracking across the soil surface like this, if it looks muddy, if your soil is plowing up in big clods, all of those are signs. If your farmer tells you, yeah, I drove my tractor into the field and it just sank into the mud, don't know how to get it out, right? That happens. That's a sign of soil degradation. A lot of the time people have talked about, yeah, you know, it was really wet and so it happened. But it's not just about it was really wet. It being really wet was one of those disturbance events. And when a soil is not well aggregated and not well managed and doesn't drain well, it stays muddy and soft and can't hold up a tractor. So we can build up that resilience again by building up that aggregation, making it a much more stable soil, allowing it to drain pretty rapidly after a rain. And then you're not going to have issues like your tractor falling in, because you're going to know to not traffic it when wet, and it's not going to take so long to get back to a point where you can get into that field. Quick story interlude. This field right here, this set of soils right here, this is two farms. One of them looks like this. One of them, the soil looks like this. This is the same soil type, but managed very differently. You can see the color difference. You can see the crusting on the surface. You can see somebody drove across this field when it was still wet. It probably wasn't draining. This farmer on the right here had been growing strawberries, and it just wasn't economical anymore because they kept getting diseases. It kept getting overly wet like this. Tried growing sweet corn, that wasn't even working anymore. We ended up working with this grower to develop a soil health management plan to really bring it back, regenerate those soils. This on the left is a diversified farm that has animals and a whole bunch of different crops, reduces tillage, basically follows all the soil health management principles that we'll get into. And they're doing great, right? This soil looks much better. It's darker, it's got plenty of organic matter, it's well aggregated. This is the kind of difference that we see all across the country. Here again, you know, side-by-side fields in this case. One of them had a cover crop growing on it. You see that water is running off clear. Looks like there's probably a little less of it. And here, no cover crop right next to it. Lots of rills, lots of erosion, lots of sediments coming off of that field. That's the kind of impact from soil health management versus not. Here, another one, no-till field right next to a conventionally tilled field. You can see the crusting and the puddling right here, and you can see that the side has already drained, right? So we can't control the weather, but we sure can control the resilience of that soil through the management of that soil. Here, this is from a farmer, Dave Brandt. After 40 years of no-till and winter cover crops, during a drought in 2012, he got 144 bushels to the acre. A neighbor of his got 40 to 80 bushels per acre, and they had done 20 years tillage, weren't growing any cover crops. Their corn was rolling up during the season, right? So again, this is the kind of impact that we get after implementing management like this. So we want to get folks to invest in soil health management. There's a long list of benefits from consistent good production, even when the weather is tough, healthier crops, reduced risk during weather extremes, right? There's less likelihood of actually losing that crop, having to replant. There's greater field trafficability. We can actually get in the field to do what we need to do. Reduced runoff, erosion, flooding, reduced temperature extremes, clean, plentiful water, air quality, healthy environment, right? I mean, we could go through all these benefits, right? This is our return on investment if we manage for healthy soils. So the exciting thing is, back 20 years ago or so, soil health was just starting to be talked about. It was mostly in the research realm. But in the meantime, soil health has exploded in the popular press. It's hard to find a farm journal, any kind of farming magazine that doesn't have something about soil health in it. And there are a huge number of books out there. So if you enjoy reading this kind of stuff, there's a lot of recommendations we could make. There are some really good books at all levels out there. Now, just briefly coming to American Farmland Trust here, thinking about soil health as part of climate. I direct the climate initiative, and we really want to help farmers and ranchers embrace those regenerative approaches for building healthy soils, gaining resilience, and thereby mitigating climate change, sequestering a lot of carbon, reducing greenhouse gases, and also adapting to that climate change and therefore improving their farm's viability even as climate change is still happening. I think that we have the opportunity to make regenerative systems commonplace, right? The new conventional agriculture I would love to see happen over the next, hopefully very soon, 5 to 10 years. We don't have much time. We need to change now quickly. I would like to see regenerative systems that build soil health become the norm, become the new commonplace conventional agriculture. So can we achieve that? Well, the more the merrier. All of us join together and we're a lot more likely to achieve that. So with that, I want to get you virtually into the field for a moment. There are some pretty cool demonstrations. And so I've got videos here for 2 of them. One is a 1-minute version with someone, Ray Archuleta. He used to be a specialist in the soil health division, worked for NRCS for many decades. He's still out there speaking and inspiring folks. And he is pretty fun to listen to. So we'll take a look at that. And then going a little more in depth on some of those demonstrations. What I'm hoping you can gain from that is some ideas for when you have conversations in the field with your landowners. They might be interested in a short version of a demo like that. It might make sense, depending on what your job is like, depending on how much you get out to the field, to pick up a soil from a degraded looking field and some soil from a fence row that has had the principles in place nicely, and to be able to provide that kind of demonstration and talk with them a little bit about what it is they're seeing there. So I am going to show you both of those videos.
I have a question to ask you. Is your soil healthy, functioning, and stable? One of the best visual diagnostic tools that I know of is the soil stability test. Here are 2 soils, exactly the same soil type. This soil has been tilled for 30 years. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It is covered with diverse plants year-round. Watch what happens when we drop the soil in the water. Notice how the conventional till soil is falling apart. The biotic glues in the organic matter are burned up by tillage. The soil pores have collapsed. Notice the no-till soil. The pore spaces are still intact. Do this test for yourself. I guarantee if you dig a little, you'll learn a lot.
There you go. Short snippet of Ray Archuleta. He's always really fun to listen to. I really enjoy his work. Now, another inspirational soil health demonstrator, Doug Peterson, also worked for the Soil Health Division and for NRCS for many years, has changed many people's minds, has been out there. He is more somebody who knows a lot about grazing, has integrated grazing into his operation. And he went a little more in depth for this soil health demonstration, which was actually as part of our videotaping for our soil health course that we put together for NRCS conservation planners, all of whom now are required to take that course. And so it's great. NRCS out there at this point, all conservation planners have a lot more of background in soil health. So gonna let you hear 17 minutes worth of Doug Peterson getting a little more in depth on these soil health demonstrations. And I'd love to get your reaction. So at some point after this, I'd love to hear from you. Did you have any aha moments? Is any of this resonating with you? Are you seeing these problems in the field? Can you see yourself doing these soil health demonstrations? So be thinking about that feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat, and I'd love to have a bit of a discussion after this.
So today we're going to look at some demos to help us understand soil function. We talked about the definition of soil function. So we got a couple of trays right here. A couple of trays. So can you see any differences in these trays? Can you see a difference in the color? Maybe a difference in the aggregation. This one, this tray is got a lot more dust to it. This tray's got more aggregates to it. So here's the deal. These two trays, even though they look pretty different, they're actually mapped exactly the same soil type. So when I went through this course several years ago, these demonstrations were one of the most eye-opening things I had ever seen. And so we're going to do those for you guys here today as part of this. So we've got two trays here. The difference is what? They're the same soil type. The difference is management, okay? This tray right here has been tilled for many years, conventional tillage, farmed every year. This tray right here is a no-till field, hasn't been tilled, hasn't had any conventional tillage in it for a long time. So we're going to take a couple of aggregates. This first demonstration is, it's called a slake test, okay? And so what it does is it measures the ability and the relationship of soil with water. It measures the ability of the soil to slake. Okay, slake is not just a term in soils. It's a term that simply means to fall away. Okay, so we've got two air-dried aggregates here, and so you can call them an aggregate. You could call them a clod. What's the difference to you in an aggregate or a clod? So to me, a clod, if you would ask a farmer, most of them are going to tell you a clod is a chunk of soil that's formed under pressure and compaction, wetness, pressure, and compaction. Whereas an aggregate is a chunk of soil, the same soil, sand, silt, and clay, a little organic matter, but it's a chunk of soil that's made up of natural processes from biology and roots, and you'll learn more about that as we go. But again, two air-dried aggregates. One comes from a long-term tilled soil. One comes from a no-tilled soil. Mapped the same soil type. We've got a couple of cylinders here. We're just going to set them in. And maybe we're going to set them in there. And now as the water soaks in, you can see the air bubbles coming out. So we know the water's soaking in. But already you can start to see some differences occurring. You can see the water. You can see the water in this side right here. See the individual particles of sand, silt, and clay are beginning to break loose. As that water soaks in, those individual particles are falling apart. They're breaking loose off of there. So, again, we'll just watch it for a couple of minutes here. So now think about this. These are the same soil type, mapped the same. Imagine now this field, is it going to be more susceptible or less susceptible to erosion compared to this field? Okay? Huge differences there. Yet, map the same soil type, same hydrologic group, everything else is the same. And so we'll just watch that for a couple of minutes here, again, as the water's soaking in. So you'll learn, as you go through this course, you'll learn that it's the biology that creates the glues that holds that soil together. The biology is what creates the secretions in the soil. The roots create those exudates that you'll learn about that hold that soil together. And in a few minutes, you'll see this is just going to be completely gone, okay? And as that's going, we'll kind of start talking about our next demonstration here. We'll just let that continue to fall. You can see the clarity of the water. So think about water quality downstream from this field compared to this field. This one's just completely clear, isn't it? As opposed to this one. And it's just going to continue. As that water soaks in, it creates pressure, and those individual particles of sand, silt, and clay that make up that clod begin to break and begin to fall away. Okay? So now, as we go to our next demonstration, we'll continue to let that react a little bit. So our next demonstration is an infiltration demonstration. So, what part of the soil does water actually infiltrate through? If I was going to pour water on this table right here, if I pour water on that table, did the water soak through that table? It didn't, did it? What would I have to do to this table to get water to soak through it? I'd have to drill holes in it, wouldn't I? I'd have to put holes in the table. The soil is the same way. Water can't go through a solid like this table, and if the soil is solid, the water can't go through the soil. So it has to have pore spaces in the soil for the water to go through. And so if we have a soil that in the presence of water, and think about it, this is just water soaking into this aggregate. It's not water pounding on the surface of the field. It's not water rushing across the field. If we add a little bit of disturbance, a little bit of motion, look how much, just a little bit of motion, look how much more movement we get from that soil as compared to this one. We can move it, and we may get some pieces breaking off the outside, but they're not individual particles of sand, silt, and clay. They're small microaggregates, and there's really very little discoloration, sedimentation in the water itself. Again, as compared to this one. So, if we have soil that in the presence of water, in the presence of rainfall, falls apart like that, what's it going to do to infiltration? Okay, so we've got our two rainfall simulator. We're going to put some soil in here. This is our this one right here again is our healthy soil. We're just going to set some soil in here. Get a couple inches of soil in there. Okay. We've got holes here. We've got holes in the bottom. We're going to make it rain. Now we'll do the same thing with our tilled soil. We're really close here. Put a little fines around the outside just to make sure we don't have any preferential flow. Okay? So one of the things that people talk about doing tillage, you know, when I grew up on a farm, I was taught we had to till the soil to get seed bed. We had to till the soil to control weeds. We had to till the soil to take out compaction. And so you saw me put this soil in these containers right here. How much compaction is in this cylinder right now? Virtually none, right? Because you saw me. I just fluffed that soil in there. No compaction. So now we're going to make it rain. And again, as we make it rain and watch this demonstration, think about aggregate stability. That's the term that you're going to learn as you go through this course. You're going to understand aggregate stability very, very well. I think if there was only one feature that I could measure when it comes to the soil, it wouldn't be a particular nutrient. It wouldn't be organic matter. It would be aggregate stability. Aggregate stability tells you more about the soil than any other single feature, I believe. Okay? And again, so aggregate stability is how stable the soil is in the presence of water. When it gets wet, do those aggregates hold their shape, or do they collapse and dissolve? If the soil collapses and dissolves like this, what's going to happen to our pore spaces? Remember, water has to go through the pore spaces. Water doesn't flow through a solid. Water flows through the pore spaces, the voids in the soil. So, we're going to add some water here. We're going to make it rain. You can see it raining through there. So as the water, as it begins to rain in these little demonstration cylinders, so this one right here, This is our healthy soil again. The water's running through it almost as fast as it rains, isn't it? Because why? Because the aggregates, just like this one, these aggregates hold their shape and the water just goes right through them and they stay there. As opposed to this cylinder, if you look at it, we'll turn it around for you. Why isn't it? You see the water stacking up on top. Because just like this soil right here, as it rains, those soil particles, those small aggregates collapse and dissolve, sealing the surface of the soil over. Even though we had just tilled this, we had just fluffed it up, there was no compaction in it because this cylinder of soil did not have any good aggregate stability. Okay? Again, aggregate stability is the term that you need to understand. It's the most important feature of the soil. So if this was a field, this was a crop field, this water, where would all this water have gone? We're actually trying to hydraulically force water through that. If this was a field that had any slope, it would all be gone, wouldn't it? It would not be available for future crop production. It would have ran off very quickly, causing flooding, causing erosion. But yet, these two cylinders are mapped exactly the same soil type. They're the same soil type. The difference is long-term management. And that was something that we just didn't understand, for decades. We thought as long as the soil was mapped a certain type, that was all that mattered. Now we understand that management influences biology, which influences aggregate stability. When I started my career 32 years ago, we had the term aggregate stability, but we were taught it was an inherent soil characteristic, not a dynamic soil characteristic. Now we realize that it changes very quickly. We can take, with the management, some of the management techniques that you're going to learn about over the next few days in this course, we can take this degraded soil and maybe not make it quite as good as this, but we can turn it pretty close into 2 or 3 or 4 years. I can take this soil with all the things that we're going to talk about and come pretty close to this in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. But guess what? I can take this soil and do tillage to it, and in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, turn it into this soil. We can degrade it that fast, okay? So now, again, and we'll sit here and watch this. This will eventually soak through, but and that was a pretty hard rain, right? We had about an inch of water in just a few minutes right there. But our rainfall events today are coming much harder than they used to. And so do we only want to capture the nice easy rains? No, we want to capture all of the rains. We want to get them to infiltrate so they don't cause flooding, so we can have production out of them. Another little demonstration that we'll do here is it's kind of a half and half. It's a little bit of a slate demo. We take some sink strainers. We take some small crumbled up aggregates. So these are kind of mini aggregates. They're not big ones. We put several of those in here into this sink strainer. We'll do the same with our tilled soil. This is kind of almost like a slump test if you know anything about concrete. Okay, so we've got a couple of sink strainers with some soil. Again, this side is our long-term tilled soil, and so what we're going to do is we're just going to wet them a little bit. We've got a couple of glasses here, and so you can get two or three things. Again, this is kind of like the slate test that we talked about a while ago. Give them just a minute here to let them soak. You can see the difference in the water. But then the real test comes here. Okay? We dump that one. We dump that one. And so then you look at the difference in the soil. This is our good soil. Dramatic difference, right? This one right here is just mush. Compared to this one, we can actually still have some aggregates. So that's going to translate into a lot of things for a farmer. This one's going to take 10, 15, 20% more fuel to drive through this field to harvest as compared to this field. This one's going to infiltrate water a lot better than this one. Just tremendous differences. So these demonstrations, there's many others that you can do, but we have found that these demonstrations right here are really the core to this course that you're gonna go through. We do these at the beginning of this course to set the stage so that you can understand. Just because the soil is mapped a certain type. I work in Iowa, I work in Missouri, and I was really concerned sometimes when I went to northern Iowa. They've got some of probably the best soil in the world. And I was really concerned that really, really good, high organic matter northern Iowa soil wouldn't slake. But you know what? Those worries were totally unfounded, because even those really, really high organic matter good soils, if they are tilled, they fall apart just like this. And if they're really healthy, they hold together just like this. We've had people do these demonstrations literally with soils all the way from Florida to Canada, East Coast to West Coast. And while they don't all act exactly the same, there is without a doubt the same differences from a healthy soil to a degraded tilled soil. So today we're going to look.
Okay, so thoughts on that? Have you seen things like this in your community? Can you imagine yourself doing these demonstrations? Do you have ideas about where you might find comparison soils like this? Are you familiar with some spots where there are high functioning soils? Are you starting to go through in your mind every farm you've been at and thinking, I think they're all degraded, right? What are your soils like? Do you have questions that are coming up?
So Bianca, let me, folks feel free to put questions or comments in the chat, but also feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and jump in if you have a thought. Celia.
Hey, while I haven't seen those demonstrations per se, I was pleasantly surprised that most of it seemed to be pretty elementary, and that common sense would tell you some of these things. As far as some of the ones that I've seen, I think it's a mixture. Once you talk to the farmers, before you even go out there, you kind of have an idea of what you're going to find. And I'm already starting to put pieces together that if they are some of our participants in our no-till program and they are members of Cattlemen's Association and Best Management Practices, or they've done things with NRCS, I've been pleasantly surprised when I go out there and I see what looks like healthy soil, even though I haven't done these particular tests. Whereas some of the ones that they're just now coming into our office for the first time, or they've never done the no-till, I'm seeing some of the drier, not as brownie-like material.
Thanks for sharing that, Celia. It's always good to hear from from situations across the country. It's really stark. It can be really visual. There are often stories, I've heard farmers tell stories about how they were about to quit farming because it was such a challenge, right? They were putting on more and more and more inputs and just couldn't afford farming anymore because they weren't getting enough back out in yield because their soils were so degraded. And then, came to a soil health workshop and had an aha moment through some of these demonstrations often, and realized, wow, maybe I'll give it a try after all. And a number of farmers have turned around their operations and are profitable and resilient today, sometimes have added new enterprises to create more biodiversity on their farms. Anybody else have experience with either doing these demonstrations, or this is the first time you've seen them? How do they strike you? I think one of the key things that you just said, Celia, is that they are really not that difficult. Once you kind of get the basic concepts, those are not too hard to explain to somebody, and it's so visual, right? It's that picture is 1,000 words kind of situation where you can just really see the impact, and it makes sense once you hear it explained that way. Are you monitoring the chat, Beth?
I am, Bianca, there's a question from, it's not related specifically. There are actually a couple of questions. I can't actually see the question from Sean, but I can see the question from Brooks. The demonstrations show that no-till is great for soil structure, but in many cases, no-till requires lots of herbicide use. Can you talk briefly about the trade-offs there or ways to avoid excessive herbicide use in no-till systems?
Yeah, that's a really key issue. There are a number of organic producers that have been working on ways to terminate cover crops without using herbicide. One of the key things is that no-till by itself is not a full soil health management system. We're about to get into the soil health management system's principles and practices. One of the key pieces about building healthy soils is that you don't want to just have the absence of tillage, because as you're pointing out, then you end up having to use a lot of herbicides because you're no longer using tillage to control your weeds. However, when farmers are successfully integrating cover crops into their systems, the cover crop biomass, basically the cover crop takes over that space in the ecosystem that weeds would otherwise take on. And so the weeds are no longer able to thrive as much. In some cases, farmers have reported that after several years of using cover crops really well and letting them grow throughout that whole part of the season where otherwise no cash crop would be growing, that after several years of doing that, they basically have very little weed seed bank left, and their weeds are not, don't come through at a level that requires a lot of suppression. Farmers who are not organic generally still use some herbicides, but many have said that they have dramatically reduced the amount of herbicide that they use when they're no-tilling, even far below what they were doing even when they were conventional and were using herbicides, because of integrating that cover crop to basically take away that space in the system. And then with that cover crop, you're growing a lot of biomass, but you're controlling what kind of biomass you're growing, and you're terminating it all at the same time. And there are various techniques for that. Some people will use herbicides. Some people will roller crimp it. There's still a lot of experimentation going on doing that successfully. And sometimes farmers will do a combination of laying down that cover crop and also using a little bit of herbicide. So there are ways definitely to reduce the amount of herbicide, and that is a very widely acknowledged piece of the no-till puzzle, right? Is there are different herbicides needed, and to manage a system that way is tricky, and there is that component of it, and people are still working on it across the country. So yeah, that is definitely a concern. And for organic agriculture, one of the things that you can do is integrate more biodiversity and more cover crops. And if you have some of that physical disturbance, but you are doing all of the other pieces of a soil health management system, you can often reduce the amount of tillage disturbance, not all the way to no-till maybe, until we figure that one out in every system that needs it. But you can very much reduce the amount of tillage and integrate these other species to achieve a system that brings in a lot more carbon, that builds up those aggregates, and often organic soils tend to be much more full of stable aggregates because of the amount of biological management that goes into those. Great question,
Great.
very important one.
So next question, Bianca, is from Sean. How do you talk to a farmer who says, cover crops will rob nutrients and water from my crops?
That is a really good question. And again, it's one that is being worked on a lot. In the Southeast, you tend to have a lot of rainfall, so it's a little less likely that it will rob water. As you go west, there are situations where in a certain kind of spring where you're getting less than normal rainfall, that cover crop can take up a lot of that water that would otherwise be there for the next crop. And so one of the things that many people are working on right now is how to make those decisions so that overall you're reducing risk in comparison to not using cover crops. And there's a lot of successes out there. So the water picture, there's definitely that there. Now, one of the things to take into account, while cover crops take up a fair bit of water when they are pretty mature right before you terminate them, they also really increase infiltration. And so a number of studies have found that if you have a cover crop going, it ends up allowing the soil to infiltrate all of the water. And because the cover crop is covering the surface with a kind of a nice moist blanket, the soil surface does not get as hot. And so you have less evaporation of that water that falls. So the overall water budget in a lot of these situations is actually that you have more of the water that you receive with rainfall during the wetter seasons, more of it stays in the soil and is then available to the crop, or that it's about even. So a lot of really positive effects there. The other piece is as you build up your soil from using cover crops, that soil is able to hold on to more water. And so that builds up that function. Now, I think the other component of that question was nutrients. And that one there, actually, the key thing about nutrients from cover crops, your cover crop is going right back in. The idea most of the time with cover crops is not to harvest them in any way. And so you're not taking away any nutrients from the system. However, when you terminate that cover crop in whatever way you do it, that cover crop starts to decompose. All those microbes in the soil are very excited to get that very diverse, nutritious diet. They go to town eating it up and release a lot of nutrients as a result that then become available slowly over time. And so you can adjust your cover crop management to allow for the release of those nutrients in time with the cash crop. There are some key pieces like nitrogen management. If your next crop needs a lot of nitrogen, like for example, corn, it would be better to have a legume in the mix leading up to corn, because legumes like peas and beans and such and vetches take nitrogen that is not usable by crops, N2, out of the air, and put that, use that through to grow their biomass. And then when that biomass is terminated, it gets decomposed, all that nitrogen becomes available to the next crop. So that piece of it, that is a way that we can actually add to the nutrients available in the soil in a natural way rather than having to use so much nitrogen fertilizer. I can say more about that if needed. There's a lot of resources out there, but I'll keep it at that because that's probably a pretty long answer already.
Great, thank you. All right, another question. Recognizing that this training is primarily focused on farmers and large acreage. However, we also work with hobby farmers, residents with flower, vegetable gardens, developers, etc. Any advice other than no-till, as it isn't as functional on less than an acre, for them to protect soil health?
Absolutely. I would say the great thing about the practices I'm going to talk about more in the next session is that really all of them are scalable. Whether you're in a flower bed in front of somebody's house, a small urban garden, a 1-acre vegetable farm, a little grazed area out back, any of those situations all the way up to the 500,000 acre farmers, the principles apply. The way you implement them will differ slightly. In terms of no-till specifically, actually, it can be much easier to not till a small garden bed because it basically reduces your workload. You just make sure that you have permanent beds. You can mulch those beds with various organic matters, whether that's straw, whether that's wood chips, if you're adding enough nitrogen in different ways. There are various different mulches, grass clippings, right? You can mulch the surface to reduce on weeds, and then all you're doing is pulling those weeds, but fewer will come up if you have a mulch surface, and then you have a no-till system, right? So gardening systems, it will absolutely work to do very reduced tillage. Basically, the only physical disturbance of that soil is when you're, say, digging up your potatoes, digging up your carrots, putting in a new plant if you're transplanting flowers, that kind of thing. But you can absolutely do this on a small scale. If you are growing things that are not cover crops year-round, whether you're growing flowers year-round, you're growing vegetables year-round in the Southeast, that's okay. The idea is if we have diverse living crops growing in the soil year-round, whether those are cover crops that are explicitly to feed the soil or whether those are crops that we then harvest, if we keep stuff growing, that's going to be better for the soil than otherwise.
Okay, I don't see any other questions right now.
Okay, well then I will continue on with the second part of this. And I'm realizing I forgot about our polls, but I'm thinking that maybe I'll just point to the polls as if you are curious to see, okay, what did I learn just now? Am I remembering some of these basic concepts? You can go to the polls, you can answer them. Maybe at the end, if we have time, we can go through all of them and see if there are any confusions about any of that content. So you can feel free to do that at whatever point. But I think I'm going to keep going because I think we're going to get more into some of the questions that you all were just asking.